Hey everyone, welcome back to our channel and the series about data engineering and data science in Microsoft Fabric. My name is Estera and today Ted joins me to discuss who sees what. So mastering permissions in Workspace and SQL. We'll discuss a super important topic that is often overlooked but crucial for every organization: Workspace access, SQL access policy, and sharing to give you the ultimate guide to setting permissions correctly. We have an expert in the house, Ted.
Hi, everyone. Yeah, pleasure to be here.
Awesome. Let's dive right in. Ted, can you start with explaining what we mean by workspace access?
Yes, so there are two levels of accesses in Fabric. Basically, you can access all the items in Workspace, which is granted for the Workspace permissions access. And within item, within certain workload like SQL or Lakehouse, you should be able to control access for individual objects. Today, we have that individual access implemented only in SQL, but soon we will have this access also implemented in other workloads too.
Great explanation. So now the next question would be, how does the SQL access policy fit into this?
Yes. So basically, once you get an access to an item, let's say that it's, for example, a lakehouse or a data warehouse, you get access to all objects within it. So all files, all tables, and you might be willing to restrict access to some of these objects, and that's where SQL policy allows you to grant or deny select permissions. So basically, using SQL statements, you can manage each individual user access for particular objects, which are tables in a data warehouse. That kind of access only applies for the data warehouse or SQL endpoint. It doesn't apply to the Lakehouse access. That's why we have an interesting configuration which comes to the workspace permissions and accesses.
Okay, so what are the best practices for setting up workspace access and
Mhm.
SQL access policy?
Okay, yeah. So in workspace access, you basically invite users to take part in the workspace, and you can assign one of the four roles. So they can be either admins, they can be members, they can be contributors or viewers. So that's what allows you to set what users will be able to do. In the very basic terms, admins, members, and contributors can read and write data. That means that they will be able to access to any of your workspace items and to do the things, which usually means changing the data, adding new data, etc. These roles slightly change based on the permissions for administration rules. That's why we have three of those. For example, contributors cannot share objects where admins and members can, and so on. But we don't need to focus that. And then we have a specific role, which is viewer, which can only read data, but that reading of data has certain nuances too. And that's where SQL policy comes into play, where basically if you have a basic viewer role, which has just a read permission, that user actually will be only able to read this data, which is granted through the SQL policy, like grant permission to read. So even if you are viewer, but you don't have any grants on the SQL endpoint, that means you will not be able to see any data.
So what about sharing permissions? Because in many cases, we want to have ability to share the artifacts, share the notebooks, share the code of Spark job definition, or for example, the pipeline. How we manage those?
So the way sharing implemented in Fabric, um, it's basically means that you assign permission for individual item for that user to have access to. So when you add user to a workspace role and you grant them certain role, whether it's admin, member, contributor, or viewer, the user automatically gets access to all of the items which are in a workspace with the permission which is granted to them. So if you're a viewer, you're able to view all of the workspace items, all notebooks, all data warehouses, all lakehouses. Now, when I go and grant user access through sharing, I grant them access only to that individual item, so none of the other workspace items will be available for the user. And the way user can access that item which I shared with them is through Data Hub, because we don't have access to the workspace, so there is no way for them to list any content of the workspace. They need to go into Data Hub and search for that item, and then it will be available there. When you share it with the user, the only permission which is granted to user is read only. So that means that user can only read data. But there are a couple of options which user can select, and afterwards change that selection through the permission management. So user in addition can select read data permission and add read data when sharing an object, which will mean that user who receives that permission can read all of the data through SQL endpoint without grant permission given to them. So we don't need to have select grant anymore for that user if they have read data permission. And the other important permission, which is related to the data access, is read all permission, which means that if you get read all permission, that grants you possibility to read data using Spark. So you will be able to see all of the data through Lakehouse Explorer or through Notebook. Without read all permission, you will not be able, as a viewer or a person who received a shared permission, you will not be able to see data using Spark or Lakehouse Explorer. So there are a couple of these specific permissions which needs to be assigned at the workspace level if you want to grant user access without going to SQL permission model and granting from there.
That is excellent. Now I am wondering what will happen if I will share my notebook. Will I share immediately also the Lakehouse or the data inside Lakehouse, the tables inside the specific Lakehouse?
No, you won't. So actually, we talked mostly about the data artifacts. Notebook is already a code artifact similar to Spark job definition. But you're absolutely right. Both Notebook and Spark job definition, they are associated with the Lakehouse. So once you share Notebook or Spark job definition separately, you need to share the Lakehouse associated with these two items. That's where the difference is with the workspace roles, because once you assign people to workspace role, they usually get access to everything. But if you want to grant individual access, you just go item by item.
Phenomenal. So before we wrap up, can you share some common mistakes or pitfalls people make?
Yes, so I would say that this permission model and different access rights could be somewhat confusing and lead to some situations where you restrict access to the data through one engine but leave a backdoor through the other one. That's the reason why we made it somewhat complex to make sure that there are no backdoors. So let's see that you have an object like a lakehouse, and in that lakehouse you have two tables. One is employees, another is salaries. Very common example. And you want to grant someone access to employees, but you don't want to grant them access to salaries. So two tables. So at SQL level, you can do that restriction through grant permission. So you can share that object with someone and do not grant them read data or read all, and then afterwards go to the SQL permission modeling and grant select only on employee table. That way, whoever receives that object shared, they will be able to see only employee table. But let's say you also want to grant access for that person through Spark. So you give them read all. The problem in this case, what will be, Spark currently doesn't have object level security. you either grant access to everything or nothing. So what now will happen, user at SQL level, using dataset, using Power BI reports and so on, because that's what uses SQL endpoint, they will be able to see only employee table. But if they will run notebook on top of this Lakehouse or Spark job definition, they will be able to access all of the data, including the salary table, which we wanted to hide them. So it's very important when you assign permissions to make sure that you think of what's your use case and what access you want to grant and what level of granularity is supported with different engines. So that's one of the mistakes maybe which users could do, and that's where we introduce this slightly more complicated access model by having additional permissions like read data and read all.
Ted, thank you so much. Can you share some more resources for viewers who want to learn more about this topic?
Yes, absolutely. So all information about access control specific to the workspaces available at Microsoft Public Documentation for the Fabric. So you could go to the data engineering section and find more information about how that applies for the Lakehouse. Also, you can go to data warehouse section and read more about all the nuances around SQL security permission. So I think these two web pages, which you can find links in the description of this episode, you will be able to basically click the link and see the content of these pages.
Ted, thank you so much. This has been incredible, informative episode. Thank you for sharing all the details, expertise about the area that you are leading as part of Fabric product group. Thank you so
Great,
much.
thank you. Thank you for having me here.
All right, folks, that's a wrap up for today. If you found this video helpful, give a thumbs up and don't forget to subscribe for more awesome content. If you have any questions, ideas, topics you would like us to cover in the upcoming videos, leave the comment below. And until the next time, stay safe and keep your data secure. See you.
Bye bye.